do we make our smartphone videos not only more cinematic, but also have the quality of moving images shot using film stock? With a camera app and some color tweaks, it can be done. For this tutorial, I'm going to be using the camera app FiLMiC Pro, but you could use another camera app if you wanted to. Open Camera is free for Android. There's also MC Pro 24ps for Android as well. So I'm going to show you the basic techniques, but I'm also going to tell you about this fantastic app called Super 16. People love films, and people love the look of films. The look has been tried and tested since cinema was invented over 100 years ago. No, not too long ago, reproducing the look of film was quite difficult without using any actual film. But digital cameras keep improving every year, making it easier and easier to achieve. And with an app like FiLMiC Pro or MC Pro 24fps for Android, we can certainly achieve a good film look using our smartphones. We'll also need the help of an ND filter for when conditions are too bright. Film can have a dreamlike quality that video doesn't, unless you use certain settings and color enhancements. When we try to create the film look, we attempt to emulate these key characteristics of film, but using a digital medium. But we really have to be careful that we don't confuse the term film look with the term cinematic. For example, this show is actually shot on film, and so is this, whereas this is shot using a digital camera. That's right, yeah, Friends and Seinfeld were both shot using film stock. And while those old sitcoms both look pretty good still, they don't necessarily look too cinematic. For that reason, seeking the film look is kind of part of creating a more cinematic look for your videos, but it's not the whole story. Digital video, whether you shoot it on a smartphone or a $60,000 cinema camera, looks very clean and precise. But people that love the look of film love the character that film gives to an image. Compared to standard smartphone shot video, film has less contrast, it's less sharp, has grain instead of noise, and has color aberrations and distortions and various other qualities. But before we look at these more distinct qualities of film, there are some basic FiLMiC Pro settings we need to get right. The first thing we need to do is to switch our frame rate to 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is the standard for movies and TV shows, which has been established for about 100 years. This frame rate came from a compromise between a smooth-looking motion and the practicality of moving 35mm film stock through a camera or projector without it breaking, not to mention the cost of buying, processing and delivering rolls of film. Therefore, when we shoot at 24 frames per second, our video will look a bit more like film, especially if we also manage to keep the shutter speed to something similar to the speed film cameras use, which is 1/48th of a second. So in FiLMiC Pro, open up camera settings and tap frame rate and now tap 24. If you're using an Android device, you might find you cannot set 24 frames per second. And that would be down to what the device manufacturer has allowed third-party app developers to change in the device. In smartphones, we generally have two ways to control exposure: shutter speed and ISO. And there's a saying I have to help remember what we're aiming for. Keep the ISO low and the shutter speed slow. ISO low, shutter speed slow. So try to keep that saying in your mind when you set exposure. Now, one big difference between a digital camera and a movie film camera is that the film camera has a rotating shutter. In a photo camera, the shutter is like a door, which flips open and closed each time you take a photo. In a film camera, however, the rotating shutter is a disc which spins around behind the lens. A portion of the disc is set to allow in the light as it spins around, and normally this will be set to 180 degrees. When setting a shutter speed in a film camera, we often refer to it as the shutter angle, and the shutter angle is measured in degrees rather than fractions of a second. Remember, there's 360 degrees in a circle, so 180 degrees is half of a circle. So a 180 degree shutter angle therefore means that the shutter is open half the time and closed half the time. With 24 frames of film going through the gate every second, that means there's a new frame every 1/24th of a second. But a rotating shutter set to 180 degrees will be open half that time. In other words, 1/48th of a second. When the shutter speed is at 1/48th, there's a certain amount of motion blur. This blur makes the video look smoother, as well as making it look more like film. That's because film is nearly always shot using this combination of 24 frames per second and 1/48 shutter speed. Now I really recommend that you don't get too hung up on this 1/48th of a second shutter speed, because if we set our shutter speed to 1/50th or 1/60th, we'll get almost the identical amount of motion blur. To make sure your shutter speed stays at 1/48th, you can set it and lock it. Open up the manual controls by tapping this button here, like a circle inside a broken circle. Now you have your shutter speed on the left at the bottom and ISO left at the top. Drag the wheel up and down until the shutter speed says 1/48th. Tap it to lock it and it turns red. Now when you drag the wheel up and down, it only changes the ISO setting. Therefore, the only way you can now adjust exposure is by changing the ISO. So what do we do if it's too bright and we can't lower our ISO and our shutter speed any further? So then our only real option is to find another way to reduce the light hitting the sensor. And one of the most popular ways to do this is to use an ND filter. An ND filter blocks some of the light, like putting sunglasses on your camera. This allows you to reduce the light hitting the sensor without pushing shutter speed too high. And this kit by Sandmark comes with 3 strengths of ND filter and a PL or polarizing filter attached. So I need to choose one which will reduce the light, but not so much that I need to boost the ISO when setting exposure. So filmmakers use ND filters to achieve slower shutter speeds. And they also come in different strengths. For example, an ND8 allows in 1/8 of the light. Smartphones use a high level of digital sharpening, which makes the video they produce look a bit less like film. And generally speaking, film has a softer look. Film is made of celluloid and chemical crystals and is exposed in a mechanical device where light can leak and bounce around, especially with older cameras. For that reason, it simply doesn't have the razor-sharp image quality created using digital sensors. In FiLMiC Pro, we can switch off digital sharpening. Currently, this is only possible using Android devices. And possibly actually not all Android devices either. If you have an iPhone, I will show you how to fix this sharpness problem later. In the settings screen, tap device and scroll to the bottom of the list. There, in Android devices, you will find 2 settings for noise reduction and sharpness. Just disable sharpness here. But personally, I have noise reduction on fast. Some people prefer to switch this off and use noise reduction in their editing software, but I find my Samsung devices have pretty good noise reduction capabilities. But if you set noise reduction to high quality, the camera is now going to sacrifice processing power to make sure noise reduction is applied. And then if your camera processor finds itself struggling to cope, the quality of your video is going to be sacrificed to maintain the noise reduction. For that reason, either switch this off or set it to fast. Another thing we might want to look at is the aspect ratio of our video. Like I say, we shouldn't confuse the film look with something being cinematic. Having a widescreen ratio isn't really a quality of film, but we do associate it with cinema and making things look cinematic. The standard aspect ratio is 16:9. That's the default. In FiLMiC Pro, tap the cog icon to open up the settings menu. Tap resolution and now you can choose a wider aspect ratio. If you toggle on crop source to overlay, then FiLMiC Pro will output your video at that ratio. Instead of using a simple crop, I'm actually going to use my Moment Gold Flare Anamorphic and then use FiLMiC Pro to de-squeeze. So in hardware, I'll toggle on 1.33 times anamorphic adapter. So again, the anamorphic lens has nothing to do with film. However, it does add some character to the image, such as lens flare, chromatic aberrations and distortions. And basically, it helps to rough up that clean digital image. I have my resolution set to 4K and my bitrate to FiLMiC Extreme. So that's going to give me high quality video files to work with. I'm also going to use the 8-bit log version 2. This will produce a flatter image, less contrast, less saturation. So in FiLMiC Pro, to get log and flat profiles, there is an extra in-app purchase. So I'm going to tell you about this really cool app called Super 16. Super 16 is an app that lets you apply film look effects to videos and photos. Within the app, there are preset looks which emulate the appearance of certain film stocks. For example, the first preset is Kodak Viz3 50D 5203. So the Viz is short for vision. And this is a real film stock still supplied by Kodak, but is actually a 35mm film stock, which by the way would cost you over $300 for a 400-foot roll, which is roughly 3.5 minutes long. The 16mm version of this stock is the 7203, and that'll be like $200 per 400 feet. So you can see the cost of shooting film is quite considerable, and you have to be very careful about what you actually film. Using our smartphones, we can just film away and we don't have to worry about such things. You'll notice there are two versions of each preset. There's a raw version and a printed version. So I'm guessing that the first version mimics the look of film after filming and processing, whereas the second version represents what happens when further down the line you add the process of creating a final print for distribution. And this app is kind of like a stripped down version of Dehancer, except it's only £5 a year. Dehancer is a really great tool for creating the film look, but it's not cheap. It's like $400. And whether these emulations are close to what actual stock looks like, I'm just not enough of an expert to tell you, but I do really like the look these filters add. And that's basically the most important thing, isn't it? To choose a filter, just swipe up and down. After the film stocks, you'll find loads of preset color grades as well. For this video, I'm just going to be using the film stock presets. When this app first came out, you could only use it as a camera app with filters, but you can now bring in photos and videos from your gallery. And this means that we can shoot using FiLMiC Pro to get better control and to shoot log if we want, and then bring clips into Super 16. So this makes this a great companion app to use with our camera apps. But how much does it cost? So Super 16 is available for free and it's actually pretty good. But if you want the full feature list, then it's about £5 a year, which is affordable compared to some of the others I've looked at, especially on iOS. I purchased it for a year so I can show you around the app properly. The app is also a camera app, so you can shoot videos directly in the app. However, there's a 1080p maximum resolution and limited exposure controls. You're probably better off shooting with another app, like FiLMiC Pro, and then importing those files. And those files can then be exported from the app at 4K as well. So another reason to use a different app to film with is that you get to keep the ungraded version of the file. If you shoot using the app, you won't be able to change the look of it later. That said, it's obviously much quicker to shoot using the app. So let's take a look at the settings. At the top, you'll notice it's set to 24 frames per second and 16:9 by default. You can change the frame rate if you wish, depending on your device. Anyway, these are only to use if you're actually going to use it as a camera app. You can also set the camera to a 4:3 ratio or use one of these effects. It's one of those effects where it looks like the projector is broken and it's showing the edges of the film. But it might be useful as a transition or some kind of other novelty use. Tap the menu icon to get a bunch of presets. You can also save your own preset here. So another thing about shooting film is that light can leak into the camera when it's not supposed to. So you can accidentally expose the film to light while you're changing the roll, for example. Or maybe there's like a hole in the film can. So there's all these kinds of hazards when you're shooting film, at $400 a roll. And if this does happen, you might get what's known as film burn. If you tap the light bulb button, you create a film burn. You have to do this live as there's no way to program it in. So if you're filming a shot and want a film burn, tap the button at the moment you want it to appear. Unfortunately, you can't use this if you're importing video files rather than just using the camera app. But anyway, I don't think I'd use this too much. Again, it might be quite nice to use during a transition or at the end of a take. Now, if you want to look at some more settings, we just tap the middle of the screen and it opens up some extra options. So let's scroll down a bit to film grain. As I said at the start, grain is one of the qualities of film that video doesn't have. There's actually some similarities with ISO and grain. Whereas with digital cameras, we can set ISO, film stocks are made with a kind of fixed ISO. They come with an ISO number. And when it comes to film, the ISO number of the film refers to how sensitive it is to light. If you wanted to shoot in a low light situation, you might use film stock with a high ISO. And high ISO film stock just so happens to have more observable and bigger grain. So the higher the ISO of the film stock, the more film grain you're going to get. So it's kind of similar to when we push up ISO in our digital camera and get lots of noise. The difference is grain probably looks nicer than digital noise. It just looks a little bit more organic. Here we can adjust the strength and the size of the film grain. I think it's a good idea to keep this effect subtle. Oh, that said, the bigger the film, the smaller the grain size. So if you wanted to emulate 8mm film, you would want a bigger grain size. 16mm film has smaller grain than 8mm, and 35mm film has smaller grain than 16mm. Let's look at other ways to add film grain. If you're using an iPhone, there's a great, affordable alternative app for adding film grain called VideoLut. Import your file, use this drop-down menu and select Adjust. Swipe to a button called Noise. There's 3 settings: denoise strength, grain, and grain size. So if your video is a bit noisy, you can actually try and remove some of that noise using the top setting. But if you want to add film grain, use these 2 sliders below. Remember, the size of grain generally relates to the size of film you want to emulate. Big for 8mm, medium for 16mm, and small for 35mm, or even smaller for 70mm. Another way to add film grain is to use an overlay layer in your editing software. You can find these film grain overlays online. I downloaded this one for free, which is an 8mm film grain. And I don't actually remember where I got it from, but if you just Google it, you'd probably find some. So basically it's a video, and if I play it, you can see it looks like old TV static from the good old days of analog TV. You can see the grain kind of moving around. In Adobe Premiere, I place it on the timeline above the clip I want to add grain to. Now I switch the blend mode to overlay and adjust the opacity, and that just controls the amount of grain. So we can do this in most editing programs, including editing apps like LumaFusion. Then you would need to copy the file multiple times so it covers all the clips you intend to have the film look. So that's a couple of alternative ways to add film grain. Anyway, let's go back to the Super 16 app and look at the next setting, which is called blur. Blur is simply a small amount of softness applied to the video. If we can't remove sharpness when filming, then we can use blur here. Again, so I'll just keep this effect quite subtle, unless you want your video to look very blurry. Right, next up is gate weave. Gate weave is when the film shifts position as it's pulled through a frame window in a film camera or projector. By default, this is set to 3, which is why the image is juddering around the frame a little. If I put it up to 10, you see it really flying around all over the place. And this is really an effect for making your video look like an old film. However, even new film might experience a very subtle amount of weave. So personally, I'll probably switch this to 0, which is off, or maybe just 1, unless I wanted to give it a real old film effect. The next setting is breath. Film breath refers to an accidental change in exposure, contrast, and color from frame to frame as the film moves. This is caused by uneven emulsion coating, the instability of the camera shutter, or maybe film development issues. This effect is again to emulate older films or indie films shot on limited budgets. Modern 35 and 70mm films shot on top-grade cameras, developed and scanned in a professional lab, shouldn't show film breath. What we might consider to be lower quality can add character, just like people grew to love the character of Polaroid photos or 8mm film. Next we have 2 settings under the heading of optics. First is chromatic. Using the chromatic setting, we can add chromatic aberrations. An aberration usually refers to some kind of flaw. When we talk about chromatic aberrations, we're talking about a failure of the camera lens to focus all colors to the same point. When this happens, there's what looks like a slight shadowing or messiness to the image, because the blue is positioned slightly differently to the red and green, for example. If I push this up to 10, you can see it's like we're looking through a really cheap lens we just bought off AliExpress for about $50. So this isn't really a look of film exactly, it's more to do with the lens. Just like the anamorphic lens I'm using will likely add some as well. Right, next there's a vignette. So vignette just creates a slight shadow around the edges of the frame. This is something we often add when grading. It just makes the frame less harsh as well as focusing the audience's eyes to the center of the frame. This might occur in a film camera when we're using a small aperture. The next bunch of settings is going to allow us to add film look defects. So defects that we have here are scratches in the film. So again, this is something to be used to age the look of the film. Over the lifetime of a print, after it's passed through a projector over and over again, they often develop these long vertical scratches. They're vertical because this is the way the film is passing through the projector, and maybe they caught something on their way. You can also adjust intensity, which just refers to how observable these scratches are. Now, the thing is, if you set the vertical scratch to 0, you still get other marks and scratches, more like holes and particles of dust and that kind of thing. If you adjust scratches color, it changes the color of the scratches from black if you set it to 0 to white if you set it to 100, with kind of shades of grey in between. When we talk about perf, we are referring to the perforations per frame of video. Perforations are those holes at the side of the film which is used to pull it through the camera projector. One thing that's a bit annoying is that you can't turn off these defects completely. Even when you turn intensity down to 0, there are still some marks popping up now and then. But hopefully they're going to change this, because this is really an effect to age the look of film. And actually I reached out to the developer of the app and they told me that this will be fixed in the next update. So then we'll be able to remove the defects completely, which, I think is great news, because this is a really cool app. So below this we have another really cool effect, which is halation. Film halation is like a glowing effect around the brightest areas of the image. If we're filming with lights in the frame, for example, halation creates a kind of red-orange glow around the lights, because film normally contains an anti-halation layer, which acts to prevent this effect occurring. It happens when light passes through the film, bounces off reflective surfaces within the camera, and then hits the film again from the back. Because film is made up of 3 colored layers with red at the back, this reflecting light hits the red layer first, causing this red halation. So radius adjusts the size of this glow, while intensity adjusts how strong the effect is. So this effect starts in the whites and spreads into the greys depending on the cutoff setting. If we reduce the cutoff setting, the effect starts to push further into the midtones of the image. You can also add an extra amount of green or blue to adjust the color of the halation. You're kind of adjusting how much the light is bounced back through the red and then into the blue and the green. Too much of these halos around light sources and overexposed image areas are seen as a flaw. However, small, subtle halos are often seen as a really desirable aesthetic when shooting on film. Right, let's go back to the top of the settings, because there's a couple of extra options there. So first we have a histogram, which is also a place to adjust the luma curve. If you drag these white dots up and down, you can adjust the look some more. If there's too much contrast in the image, push up these middle dots. If there's not enough, pull them down. It's generally best to try to keep this black line in a smooth curve. Below that are basic white balance settings. If the color looks off, you can adjust the temperature and tint. You can also increase or decrease color saturation. So those are just like basic color adjustment tools, but they're pretty useful to have anyway. So I had to hunt around for something like Super 16, but for iPhone, and I really couldn't find anything. Maybe you know better. If you know of one, please let me know. I'd love to try it out. DaVinci Resolve has a free version, and I'm guessing the Dehancer plugin will work with it, but that's still quite an investment. There's another plugin for Resolve called FilmBox, but that's going to be like $1,000. So I did again ask the developer about this, and he told me that an iOS version is in the works, but he unfortunately gave no indication of how long we might have to wait. So I wouldn't hold your breath too long there. A simple way to reduce the extra sharpness we get from smartphones is to use a tiny amount of blur. In Adobe Premiere Pro, you can adjust sharpness to a negative value, for example, or you could add a blur effect and turn it right down. Another option is to use this great color grading app for iOS called VideoLut. Compared to some of the apps for iPhone, this one is really very good value and is a great app in its own right. I spoke to the developer and asked them to add a de-sharpening option, and they did, and it works very well. And another thing about this app is that it actually has presets for FiLMiC Pro, Log version 2, Log version 3, and flat profiles. It's full of tons and tons of settings. It's in some way actually a bit overwhelming, but it's definitely something to look at, I would say. So all the features in FiLMiC Pro and Super 16 I've gone through here give you an understanding of the subtle differences that make film look different to video. Dehancer has even more features as well. Many of the looks from Super 16 can be achieved in different ways. For example, there are LUTs available to mimic film stock, but they only change the tone and color. We could use a glow effect to mimic halation, which we can apply in editing software like Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere, and DaVinci Resolve. We could use a diffusion filter, which adds some similar properties to film as well, or rather the look of older lenses, which can have less anti-reflective coating, and this can result in a more misty image. But just remember, there's no one film look. There are lots of characteristics of film that are usually missing in video. Which of these characteristics we want to add is a creative choice that comes from the story you want to tell. If we wanted to show a scene from the past, we might use big grain, lots of scratches, gate weave, and so on, to make the video look like an old 8mm film that's worn out over the decades. And then the look becomes a quick way to tell the audience this scene happened a long time ago. The most important thing is to play around and have fun with it, and hopefully this video has given you some ideas to try out. So that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up. And just wanted to say a massive thanks to all my new members on Patreon, and well, also of course the old ones who are still there. So if you want to learn more about smartphone filmmaking, you can join us on Patreon, including my 170-page smartphone filmmaking beginners to advanced book, and all kinds of other stuff. So that's it for this, and I'll see you next time. Ciao. Oops.